The blade pressed against Michelle Lewis's throat as she stood frozen in the doorway of the mountain cabin, her swollen belly making escape impossible. Behind her, 7-year-old Carolyn Ross whimpered, clutching a rag doll to her chest. The man holding the knife reeked of whiskey and unwashed flesh, his yellow teeth bared in a cruel grin. "You thought you could steal what's mine, woman," he snarled, pressing the steel deeper until a thin line of blood appeared on Michelle's neck. "That mountain man you bought like some kind of slave, he belongs to me. Got debts to pay." Michelle's hands trembled as she placed them protectively over her unborn child. The baby kicked frantically inside her as if sensing the danger. She had come so far from that day 6 months ago when desperation had driven her to the most unlikely decision of her life. Now it seemed that choice might cost her everything. The stranger's eyes gleamed with malice as he glanced toward the back room where Charles Allen lay recovering from his latest injury. "You gonna call him out here, or do I gut you first and let the little girl watch? Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Now let me take you back to where this all began, to understand how a pregnant widow came to purchase a wounded mountain man and his daughter, and how that desperate act would change all their lives forever." 6 months earlier, Michelle Lewis stood outside the ramshackle trading post in the settlement of Pine Ridge, her last $5 clutched in her trembling hand. The November wind cut through her thin coat like ice, and the weight of her growing child made every step an effort. Her husband had been dead 3 months now, killed in a mining accident that left her with nothing but debts and the baby she carried. The sign outside the trading post read "Debtor's Sale" in crude lettering, and Michelle knew she was looking at her last chance. Inside, desperate people gathered to bid on whatever possessions unfortunate souls had to offer in exchange for coin. She had heard whispers about today's sale, rumors that made decent folk cross themselves and hurry past. A man was selling himself and his daughter to pay off gambling debts. Michelle pushed through the crowd of rough miners and trappers, their unwashed bodies pressing close in the smoky interior. At the front of the room stood a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. Charles Allen was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that hung past his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. A fresh bandage wrapped around his left arm showed blood seeping through, and his face bore the marks of recent violence. Beside him stood a small girl with tangled brown hair and eyes too old for her 7 years. "Carolyn Ross," the auctioneer announced, though Michelle noticed the child flinched at the name. The girl's dress was patched and dirty, but she held herself with quiet dignity that broke Michelle's heart. The bidding started at $20. Michelle listened as rough voices called out amounts, each bid accompanied by lewd comments about what they intended to do with their purchases. Her stomach turned as she realized these men saw the mountain man as cheap labor and the child as something far worse. $30, called a bearded trapper with rotting teeth. "40, shouted a mine foreman known for his cruelty to workers. Michelle's hand shook as she raised it. $50. The crowd turned to stare at the pregnant woman in her worn dress and thin coat. Laughter rippled through the room, harsh and mocking. The auctioneer squinted at her doubtfully. "You got $50, lady. You look like you ain't got 50 cents. Michelle opened her coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, the last of her husband's savings that she had hidden from the creditors. "I have the money." Charles Allen's eyes met hers across the room, and she saw something flicker there. Surprise, perhaps, or hope. The little girl pressed closer to his side, her small hand gripping his larger one. The bidding continued, climbing higher than Michelle could afford. Her heart sank as the amounts reached $70, then $80. She was about to turn away when she noticed something odd. Charles Allen was whispering to his daughter, and the child was nodding seriously. Suddenly, the mountain man spoke up, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Any man who bids on us better know what he's getting. I got a bad arm that may never heal right. The girl's got nightmares that wake the dead. We ain't worth much to anybody." The bidding faltered as Charles Allen continued his litany of problems. He described old injuries that slowed him down, the child's tendency to hide when strangers approached, their lack of useful skills beyond basic survival. With each word, the enthusiasm of the bidders cooled. Michelle watched in amazement as the mountain man systematically destroyed his own value in the auction. The miners and trappers began to mutter among themselves, reconsidering their bids. When the auctioneer called for final offers, only two voices responded, $60 from the mine foreman, and Michelle's trembling reply, 65. The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot. Sold to the lady for $65. Michelle's legs nearly gave out as she made her way forward to complete the transaction. Charles Allen watched her approach with an unreadable expression, while Carolyn Ross peeked out from behind his coat. As Michelle handed over the last of her savings, the mountain man leaned close enough for only her to hear. Why? He asked simply. Michelle looked into his weathered face, seeing intelligence and pain in equal measure. Because everyone deserves better than this. The walk to Michelle's small cabin took over an hour through the mountain snow. The cabin Michelle called home was hardly more than a shack, with one main room, a small bedroom, and a lean-to kitchen. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the windows were covered with oiled paper instead of glass. But it was warm and clean, with a good stone fireplace and a well that provided fresh water. Charles Allen stood in the doorway, taking in the sparse furnishings and obvious poverty. You don't have money for food, let alone 2 more mouths to feed. Michelle settled heavily into her one good chair, exhaustion weighing on her like a physical burden. I know, but I couldn't let them buy you, not for what they intended. The mountain man's jaw tightened. You know what I am, what I've done. Michelle shook her head. I know you protected that little girl when you could have sold her separately for more money. I know you talked down your own value to keep the worst men from bidding. That tells me everything I need to know about what you are. Carolyn Ross crept closer to the fireplace, drawn by its warmth. She had not spoken a word since leaving the trading post, but her eyes tracked every movement Michelle made. The child was clearly terrified, expecting cruelty or abandonment at any moment. Charles Allen knelt beside his daughter, his voice gentle. Carolyn, this is Mr. Lewis. She's going to take care of us for a while. The little girl looked up at Michelle with solemn eyes. Are you going to hurt us? Michelle's heart broke at the question. She slid from her chair to kneel at the child's level, moving slowly to avoid startling her. No, sweetheart. I'm never going to hurt you. You're safe here. For the first time, Carolyn Ross smiled. It was a tiny, hesitant expression, but it transformed her entire face. Can I help with the baby when it comes? Michelle felt tears prick her eyes. I would like that very much. That first night, they worked out the practical arrangements. Charles Allen would sleep in the main room by the fire, while Carolyn would share Michelle's bed. The mountain man insisted on examining the cabin's defenses, checking the door and window latches with professional thoroughness. You expecting trouble? Michelle asked, watching him test the strength of the doorframe. Charles Allen's expression darkened. Man I owed money to, he ain't the forgiving type. Might come looking to collect what he thinks I still owe. Michelle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. What kind of debt? Gambling. Lost more than I had, tried to win it back, lost more still. Got desperate and borrowed from the wrong man. He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to the bandage on his arm. When I couldn't pay, he took it out of my hide. Would have taken it out of Carolyn too if I hadn't agreed to the auction. The implications of his words settled over Michelle like a dark cloud. She looked at the little girl, now curled up by the fire with her doll, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. No one would hurt this child while she drew breath. Charles Allen seemed to read her thoughts. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into. Lady, I'm grateful, don't mistake me, but you might have bought yourself more trouble than you can handle. Michelle straightened, her hand resting on her swollen belly. My name is Michelle Lewis, and this is my home. Whatever trouble comes, we'll face it together. The mountain man studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Lewis. We'll face it together. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the mountain meadow. Charles Allen was on his feet instantly, his good hand moving to the knife at his belt. Through the trees, Michelle could see 3 riders approaching at a steady pace. Get Carolyn and go to the back room, Charles Allen ordered, his voice tight with tension. Lock the door and don't come out no matter what you hear. Michelle felt her baby kick frantically as fear flooded her system. Who is it? Trouble was all he said, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. Michelle hurried inside and scooped up Carolyn Ross, who had been playing quietly with her doll by the fireplace. The child immediately sensed danger, her body going rigid with familiar terror. They made it to the bedroom just as the riders reached the cabin. Michelle locked the door and pulled Carolyn down behind the bed, both of them straining to hear what was happening outside. "Well, well," a rough voice called out. "If it ain't Charles Allen, the man who thinks he can run away from his debts." "I ain't running," Charles Allen replied, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "Just trying to earn enough to pay what I owe." Laughter, harsh and mocking. "You think chopping wood for some pregnant whore is going to earn you $200. "I'll get your money, Kyle," Charles Allen said. "Just need more time." "Time's up," came the reply. "You had 6 months to pay me back. Instead, you disappear into the mountains like some kind of hermit." The sound of boots on the cabin's front porch made Michelle's heart race. They were coming inside. "Leave the woman out of this," Charles Allen's voice was sharp with warning. "This is between you and me." More laughter. "Oh, I don't think so. See, I've been thinking about our arrangement. $200 is a lot of money, but a woman like that, especially one desperate enough to buy herself a mountain man, she might be worth even more." Michelle's blood turned to ice as the implications hit her. She looked at Carolyn's terrified face and knew she had to do something. These men would not be satisfied with just collecting their debt. The sound of scuffling came from the main room, followed by a grunt of pain. Charles Allen was fighting, but with his injured arm and 3 men against him, the outcome was inevitable. "Stay here," Michelle whispered to Carolyn. "No matter what happens, stay hidden." Before the child could protest, Michelle unlocked the bedroom door and stepped into the main room. What she saw made her stomach lurch. Charles Allen was on his knees, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. 2 men held his arms, while a third, clearly Kyle Morgan, stood over him with a satisfied smirk. Kyle Morgan was a thin man with pale eyes and a neat beard, dressed in a fine coat that marked him as prosperous. He looked more like a banker than a thug, but the casual cruelty in his expression was unmistakable. "Well now," he said, turning to Michelle with obvious interest. "Ain't you a pretty thing? Heavy with child, too. Some men pay extra for that." Michelle forced herself to stand straight, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You want money? I'll get you money. Just leave us alone." Kyle Morgan circled her slowly like a predator sizing up prey. "You'll get me money. And just how do you plan to do that, sweetheart? I have things I can sell. Personal items, family heirlooms. Give me a week and I'll have your $200. The gambling house owner laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your word. The word of a woman desperate enough to buy herself a man at auction." He moved closer, close enough that Michelle could smell the pomade in his hair and the whiskey on his breath. "I think I'll just take what's owed to me right now, starting with you." That's when Charles Allen broke free. Despite his injuries, the mountain man moved with lethal speed. His good arm swept one of his captors off his feet, while his elbow caught the second in the solar plexus. Before Kyle Morgan could react, Charles Allen had his knife pressed to the gambling boss's throat. "You're going to walk out of here and never come back," Charles Allen growled, "and you're going to forget about the money I owe you." Kyle Morgan's pale eyes glittered with rage, but he held very still with the blade at his neck. "You think killing me will solve your problems?" "Maybe," Charles Allen agreed, "but you won't be around to see it." Then Kyle Morgan smiled, a cold expression that chilled Michelle to the bone. "You know what, Allen? Maybe I should just write off your debt and walk away. But I want something in return." "What?" Charles Allen asked suspiciously. "The woman. She comes with me and we call it even." "Never." Charles Allen's voice was flat and final. Kyle Morgan's smile widened. "Then I guess we're at an impasse. You can't kill all 3 of us. And even if you could, more men will come." Michelle saw the truth in the gambling boss's words reflected in Charles Allen's face. He was outnumbered and outgunned, fighting with one good arm against professional killers. That's when she made her decision. "I'll go with you," Michelle said quietly. Both men turned to stare at her in shock. Charles Allen's face went white. "No, absolutely not." Michelle stepped forward, her chin raised with determination she didn't feel. "If I go with you willingly, you leave them alone. Charles Allen and the little girl, they're free of your debt." Kyle Morgan considered the offer, his pale eyes calculating. "You do that, leave your mountain man and come with me to pay his debts." "Yes," Michelle said simply. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Michelle saw Charles Allen's face crumble, saw the desperate protest forming on his lips. But before he could speak, a small voice cut through the tension. No, Carolyn Ross stood in the bedroom doorway, her rag doll clutched to her chest and tears streaming down her face. Don't take our mama away. The simple words hit the room like a thunderclap. Kyle Morgan's eyebrows rose in surprise, while his men exchanged confused glances. Charles Allen's knife hand trembled slightly, but he kept the blade steady at the gambling boss's throat. Your mama, Kyle Morgan repeated slowly, his gaze moving between Michelle and the little girl. Well, ain't that interesting? Carolyn Ross stepped further into the room, her small chin jutting out with stubborn courage. She is our mama now. You can't have her. Michelle felt her heart break at the child's fierce declaration. In the weeks since the auction, she had grown to love Carolyn like her own daughter, but she hadn't realized the feeling was mutual. Kyle Morgan's calculating mind was clearly working through this new information. A family bond changed the dynamic entirely. He couldn't simply take Michelle without expecting retaliation from Charles Allen, and a mountain man with nothing left to lose was a dangerous enemy indeed. You know what, Kyle Morgan said slowly, I think I've been approaching this all wrong. See, I came here thinking I was collecting a debt from a worthless gambler. But what I found instead is something much more valuable. Charles Allen's grip tightened on his knife. What are you talking about? I'm talking about family, Kyle Morgan replied with that cold smile. A pregnant woman, a mountain man, and a little girl, all playing house in this cozy cabin. You know what that looks like to me. It looks like people who care about each other. Michelle felt dread settling in her stomach like a stone. Where is this going? It's going to a new arrangement, Kyle Morgan said. See, I don't just want my $200 anymore. I want $500, and I want it in 1 month. Charles Allen's face darkened. That's impossible, and you know it. Oh, but I don't think it is, Kyle Morgan continued smoothly. You see, I've been watching this little family of yours. The woman's got education, speaks proper English. The mountain man's got skills, knows these mountains better than anyone. Michelle's blood chilled as she began to understand what he was suggesting. You want us to work for you. Not work, Kyle Morgan corrected. Partner with me. There's good money to be made in these mountains for people who know what they're doing. Smuggling, mostly. Charles Allen's voice was deadly quiet. What kind of goods? The kind that pay well and don't ask questions, Kyle Morgan replied. You help me with a few buys, and your debt is cleared. And if we refuse, Michelle asked, though she already knew the answer. Kyle Morgan's smile turned predatory. Well, then I guess we go back to the original plan. But before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the meadow again. This time, however, the rhythm was different. Faster, more urgent, and coming from multiple directions. Kyle Morgan's confident expression flickered as he recognized the sounds. His men moved toward the windows, hands reaching for their weapons. Expecting company? Charles Allen asked dryly. Kyle Morgan's pale eyes narrowed. No, we are not. Through the cabin's small windows, Michelle could see riders emerging from the tree line. But these weren't more of Kyle Morgan's men. These riders wore the distinctive blue uniforms of territorial marshals, and they were surrounding the cabin with military precision. Well, Charles Allen said with grim satisfaction, looks like somebody's been asking questions about you, Kyle. The gambling boss's face went white as he realized his situation had just become much more complicated. Being caught threatening a pregnant woman and child would be bad enough, but if the marshals had evidence of his other activities, he was looking at serious prison time. Let me go, Kyle Morgan hissed, the knife still at his throat. Charles Allen considered the offer for a moment, then shook his head. I don't think so. See, you made a mistake when you threatened my family. The sound of boots on the cabin's front porch announced the arrival of the law. A strong voice called out from outside. This is Marshal Jonathan Thomas. We have the cabin surrounded. Come out with your hands visible. Michelle felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly buckled her knees. Jonathan Thomas was known throughout the territory as an honest lawman, one of the few who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Charles Allen made his decision quickly. He stepped back from Kyle Morgan, but kept his knife ready. You heard the man. Time to go. Kyle Morgan's face twisted with rage, but he was trapped and he knew it. His men were already moving toward the door, their hands raised in surrender. The gambling boss had no choice but to follow. As the marshals took Kyle Morgan and his men into custody, Michelle sank into her chair with exhaustion. The baby kicked frantically inside her, responding to the stress and adrenaline of the confrontation. Carolyn Ross ran to her side, climbing into her lap despite Michelle's swollen belly. "Are they going to take us away too?" the little girl whispered. "No, sweetheart," Michelle said, stroking Carolyn's tangled hair. "We're safe now." Marshal Jonathan Thomas entered the cabin, his weathered face kind but serious. "Mrs. Lewis, I presume. We've been looking for Kyle Morgan for quite some time." Michelle looked at Charles Allen, who was carefully cleaning his knife before returning it to its sheath. "Someone reported him." The mountain man's expression was carefully neutral. "Might have been anyone. Kyle Morgan's got a lot of enemies," but Michelle caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided her eyes. Charles Allen had somehow gotten word to the authorities about Kyle Morgan's visit. As the marshals prepared to leave with their prisoners, Kyle Morgan turned back toward the cabin. His pale eyes found Michelle through the doorway, and his voice carried clearly across the yard. "This ain't over," he called. "I got friends, people who owe me favors." Marshal Ty Thomas grabbed Kyle Morgan's arm and propelled him toward the waiting horses. "Keep talking, and I'll add threatening witnesses to your charges." But the damage was done. Michelle felt the chill of those words settle into her bones. That evening, as the mountain wind howled around the cabin and snow began to fall, Michelle sat by the fire with Carolyn Ross in her lap. The little girl had been unusually quiet since the marshals left, her small face serious with thoughts too heavy for her years. Charles Allen worked at the table, cleaning and checking his weapons with methodical care. The confrontation with Kyle Morgan had reminded them all how vulnerable they were in their isolated mountain home. "Mr. Allen," Carolyn said suddenly, "are the bad men going to come back?" The mountain man looked up from his rifle, his expression gentle despite the gravity of his words. "Maybe, little one. But if they do, we'll be ready for them." Michelle felt the baby shift inside her, a restless movement that had become more frequent as her due date approached. The stress of the day had taken its toll, and she could feel her body responding with warning signs she couldn't ignore. "Charles," she said quietly, "I think we need to talk about what happens when the baby comes." He set down his rifle and moved to kneel beside her chair. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm 8 months along, and the nearest doctor is a day's ride away. If something goes wrong during the birth, if there are complications, you and Carolyn could be left alone up here with Kyle Morgan's friends looking for revenge." The mountain man's face tightened with concern. "Nothing's going to go wrong. You don't know that," Michelle replied firmly. "We need to be practical. If something happens to me, you need to take Carolyn and leave this place." Charles Allen shook his head stubbornly. "We're not going anywhere without you." Carolyn Ross looked up at Michelle with wide, frightened eyes. "You're not going to die, are you, Mama?" The casual use of the word mama made Michelle's heart clench with emotion. This child had been through so much loss already. The thought of abandoning her, even through death, was unbearable. "I'm going to do everything I can to stay with you, sweetheart," Michelle said, hugging Carolyn close. "But sometimes grown-ups have to make plans for things we hope will never happen." Over the next few days, they worked together to prepare for multiple possibilities. Charles Allen used his knowledge of the mountains to identify several escape routes from the cabin, places they could hide if Kyle Morgan's associates came looking for them. Michelle, meanwhile, prepared for the birth as best she could with limited resources. She gathered clean cloths, boiled water, and tried to remember everything her mother had told her about childbirth. As her due date approached, Michelle found herself watching Charles Allen with growing appreciation for the man she had impulsively purchased at auction. He worked tirelessly to improve their defenses and provide for their needs, never complaining about his injured arm or the danger they all faced because of his past mistakes. More importantly, she saw how he interacted with Carolyn Ross. The little girl clearly adored him, following him around the cabin and hanging on his every word. He was patient with her questions, gentle with her fears, and protective in a way that spoke of genuine love rather than mere obligation. One evening, as they sat around the fire after dinner, Carolyn fell asleep against Charles Allen's shoulder. Michelle watched him carefully adjust his position to make the child more comfortable, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he smoothed her tangled hair. "She's lucky to have you," Michelle said quietly. Charles Allen's expression was somber. "I'm the reason she's in danger in the first place. If I hadn't been so stupid about gambling, none of this would have happened." Michelle considered his words carefully before responding. We all make mistakes, Charles. What matters is what we do to fix them. The mountain man looked at her with something like wonder in his storm gray eyes. You could have bought anyone at that auction. Why did you choose us? Michelle thought back to that day in the trading post, remembering the desperation and fear that had driven her there. Because you protected her when you could have saved yourself. Because you talked down your own value to keep the worst men from bidding. Because when I looked at you, I saw someone who understood what it meant to be desperate and alone. Charles Allen was quiet for a long moment, his hand still stroking Carolyn's hair as she slept. I never had a family before, he said finally. Don't really know how to do it right. Michelle smiled, feeling the baby kick gently inside her as if responding to the conversation. None of us do, Charles. We just figure it out as we go along. That night, Michelle woke to the sound of Carolyn crying out in her sleep. The little girl was having another nightmare, her small body thrashing in the bed they shared. Michelle gathered her close, whispering soothing words until the child calmed. It's okay, sweetheart, Michelle murmured. You're safe. We're all safe. But even as she spoke the words, Michelle felt a nagging doubt. Kyle Morgan was in custody, but his threats still echoed in her mind. As if summoned by her fears, the sound of breaking glass shattered the night's quiet. Michelle bolted upright, her heart hammering as she recognized the sound of the cabin's front window being smashed. Charles Allen was already moving, his rifle in his hands as he crept toward the main room. Stay back, he whispered urgently. Keep Carolyn quiet. Michelle pulled the terrified child close, both of them trembling as they listened to the sounds of intrusion from the next room. Heavy footsteps, rough voices, the scrape of furniture being overturned. Then Charles Allen's voice, sharp with warning. That's far enough. State your business or get out. Laughter, cruel and familiar. Our business is with you, Mountain Man. Kyle Morgan sends his regards. Michelle's blood turned to ice as she realized their worst fears had come true. Kyle Morgan's associates had found them, and this time there would be no marshals to intervene. That's when she felt the first contraction. The pain hit her like a physical blow, radiating from her lower back around to her swollen belly. The baby was coming, and it was coming now in the worst possible moment imaginable. Carolyn Ross felt Michelle's body tense and looked up with frightened eyes. What's wrong? The baby, Michelle gasped, trying to breathe through the pain. The baby's coming. The bedroom door suddenly rattled as someone tested the handle. Michelle's heart stopped as she realized one of the intruders had discovered their hiding place. Carolyn Ross pressed closer to her, both of them holding their breath as they waited to see if the door would hold. The handle turned slowly, but the lock held. For now. Open up! A rough voice called through the door. We know you're in there. Michelle felt another contraction building and bit down on her sleeve to muffle any sound. The pain was becoming overwhelming, and she could feel the baby's head beginning to crown. There was no stopping the birth now, even with killers just feet away. Carolyn Ross seemed to understand the gravity of the situation without being told. The 7-year-old positioned herself to help with the delivery, her small hands steady despite the terror that must have been coursing through her young body. The sound of splintering wood announced that the intruders had found an axe. They were chopping through the bedroom door, and it wouldn't hold much longer. That's when Charles Allen's voice rang out from the main room, filled with desperate fury. You want me? Here I am. Leave the woman and child alone. The chopping stopped, and Michelle heard heavy footsteps moving away from the bedroom door. Charles Allen had drawn their attention back to himself, buying her precious time to deliver the baby. But at what cost? The sound of fighting resumed with renewed violence. Michelle could hear Charles Allen grunting with effort and pain, the distinctive sound of his knife blade striking flesh, the crash of bodies hitting furniture. He was fighting for all their lives, and she knew he would die before he let them reach her and Carolyn. Another contraction seized her, and this time Michelle couldn't hold back a small cry. The baby was coming, whether she was ready or not. I can see the head, Carolyn whispered, her young voice filled with wonder despite their desperate circumstances. Michelle bore down with the next contraction, feeling the baby slide free into Carolyn's waiting hands. The child was small but perfectly formed, with a lusty cry that announced her arrival to the world. It's a girl, Carolyn said softly, tears streaming down her face. She's beautiful. Michelle reached for her daughter with trembling hands, overwhelmed by emotion even in the midst of their danger. The baby was healthy and strong, her cries a defiant sound of life in the face of death. But their moment of joy was shattered by a terrible sound from the main room. Charles Allen's voice, raised in pain and rage, then suddenly cut off. The fighting stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that chilled Michelle to the bone. Footsteps approached the bedroom door again, and this time there was no one left to stop them. The damaged door burst open under a heavy boot, and two men entered the room. They were rough-looking characters with cruel faces and weapons in their hands. Their eyes took in the scene before them, the woman who had just given birth and the little girl protecting her, and their expressions showed no mercy. "Well, well," the first man said with a nasty grin. "Looks like we interrupted a family moment." Michelle clutched her newborn daughter to her chest, her body still weak from the birth, but her spirit blazing with protective fury. "Stay away from us." The second man laughed harshly. "You ain't in a position to make demands, lady." "Where is Charles?" Michelle demanded, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Your mountain man put up quite a fight," the first intruder replied. "But all fights end eventually." The implication of his words hit Michelle like a physical blow. Charles Allen was dead, killed defending them while she gave birth to her daughter. But even in her grief and despair, Michelle felt something else rising within her, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. These men had taken Charles Allen's life, but they would not take her children, not while she still drew breath. Carolyn Ross seemed to sense Michelle's resolve. The little girl positioned herself between Michelle and the intruders, her small chin raised defiantly despite her obvious terror. "You can't have our mama," Carolyn said with surprising strength. "She belongs to us." The first man's grin widened at the child's defiance. "Feisty little thing, ain't you?" Michelle felt her newborn daughter stir in her arms, the baby's cries growing stronger as if she too sensed the danger surrounding them. The sound seemed to pierce the cabin's walls and echo across the mountains, a primal call that demanded protection and justice. And then, impossibly, Michelle heard an answering sound from outside the cabin. Hoofbeats approaching fast and hard, multiple riders coming from different directions. The two intruders heard it too, their confident expressions faltering as they realized they might not be alone after all. They moved to the broken window, peering out into the darkness with growing alarm. "Who the hell is that?" the second man muttered. The answer came in the form of a familiar voice calling out across the mountain meadow. "This is Marshal Jonathan Thomas. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." Michelle felt a surge of hope so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. Somehow the marshals had found them again. But her hope was tempered by the grim reality of their situation. Even if the marshals could capture these men, Charles Allen was still gone. The intruders were clearly debating their options, their weapons still trained on Michelle and the children, but their attention divided by the approaching lawmen. They were trapped, but that made them more dangerous, not less. That's when Michelle heard something that made her heart leap with impossible hope. A voice from the main room, weak but unmistakably alive. "Michelle, are you all right?" Charles Allen was not dead, injured certainly, but alive and still fighting. The sound of his voice gave Michelle strength she didn't know she possessed. "We're here," she called back, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "We're all here." The two intruders spun toward the sound, their faces twisted with fury and disbelief. The first man raised his weapon, clearly intending to finish what they had started. But he never got the chance. The bedroom window exploded inward, and as Charles Allen came through it like an avenging angel, his clothes torn and bloody, but his eyes blazing with protective fury. He moved with lethal precision despite his injuries, his knife finding its mark before either intruder could react. The fight was brief but decisive. Charles Allen fought with the desperate strength of a man protecting his family, and the intruders discovered too late that they had underestimated the mountain man's resilience and skill. When the violence ended, Charles Allen knelt beside Michelle and gathered both her and the baby into his arms. His face was battered and bloody, but his touch was gentle as he examined them for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "Either of you." Michelle shook her head, too overwhelmed with relief and emotion to speak. Carolyn Ross threw herself into Charles Allen's embrace, sobbing with relief and joy. "I thought you were dead," the little girl cried. "I thought the bad men killed you." Charles Allen's voice was rough with emotion as he held them close. "Takes more than a couple of thugs to get rid of me, little one." I promise to protect you, and I keep my promises. As the marshals secured the scene and tended to Charles Allen's injuries, Michelle sat in her chair by the fire, nursing her newborn daughter and marveling at how much their lives had changed in the space of a few hours. The baby was healthy and strong, her tiny fingers gripping Michelle's with surprising strength. Carolyn Ross hovered nearby, fascinated by her new sister and eager to help in any way she could. The trauma of the attack seemed to have strengthened rather than broken her spirit, and Michelle saw a new maturity in the child's eyes. Marshal Jonathan Thomas approached them with a grave expression, his weathered face showing the strain of the night's events. "Mrs. Lewis, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here." Michelle nodded, shifting the baby to a more comfortable position. "The intruders said they were working for Kyle Morgan. They came here for revenge." The marshal's expression darkened. "Kyle Morgan escaped from custody 2 days ago, killed a guard in the process. We've been tracking him and his associates across 3 territories." Michelle felt a chill of fear despite the warmth of the fire. "He's still out there." "For now," Marshal Thomas admitted. "But after tonight, his organization is finished. We've rounded up most of his men, and the ones who aren't dead or captured are running for their lives." Charles Allen looked up from where a deputy was bandaging his wounds. "What about the bounty on our heads?" "There is no bounty." "Yuram Oishigio." The marshal replied, "But Kyle Morgan was a wanted criminal with no legal authority to put a price on anyone's head. You're all free to live your lives without looking over your shoulders." The words should have brought relief, but Michelle found herself thinking about the future with uncertainty. The cabin was damaged, their meager savings were gone, and they now had a newborn to care for along with all their other challenges. As if reading her thoughts, Marshal Thomas continued, "There's something else you should know. The territorial government has been looking for people to help establish new settlements in the mountain regions. Families who know how to survive in harsh conditions and can serve as examples for other settlers." Michelle looked at Charles Allen, seeing the same spark of interest in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. "What kind of help?" "Land grants," the marshal explained. 160 acres per family, plus assistance with building and materials and supplies. The territory wants to encourage stable, law-abiding families to put down roots in the mountains. Charles Allen's voice was carefully neutral. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Marshal Thomas replied. "Just the expectation that you'll be good neighbors and help other settlers when they need it. The territory needs people like you, folks who understand what it takes to build something lasting in difficult country." Michelle looked around the damaged cabin, then at Carolyn Ross and her newborn daughter, and finally at Charles Allen. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow with no prospects and no hope. Now she was part of a family that had survived everything life could throw at them. "We'll need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," the marshal agreed. "Take all the time you need. The offer will stand whenever you're ready." After the marshals left with their prisoners, the 3 adults and 2 children were left alone in the quiet cabin. Charles Allen had insisted on staying awake to keep watch, despite his injuries and exhaustion. Carolyn Ross had finally fallen asleep by the fire, her ragdoll clutched tightly in her arms. Michelle sat in her chair, holding her daughter and watching Charles Allen tend the fire. The events of the night had shown her something she hadn't fully understood before. This man, whom she had purchased at an auction out of desperation and pity, had become the center of their small family's world. "Charles," she said quietly, "what do you think about the marshal's offer?" He looked up from the fire, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the dancing flames. 160 acres is a lot of land. Could build a real house, maybe run some cattle." Michelle heard the longing in his voice, the dream of something better than mere survival. "Is that what you want?" Charles Allen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Michelle to the sleeping Carolyn, then to the baby in Michelle's arms. "What I want is to give you and the children the kind of life you deserve. A real home, not just a place to hide from the world." Michelle felt tears prick her eyes at the simple sincerity of his words. "You've already given us more than we ever hoped for." The mountain man shook his head slowly. "I've given you trouble and danger, put you all at risk because of my past mistakes." "You've given us a family," Michelle corrected firmly. "You've shown Carolyn what it means to have a father who cares about her. You've protected us when we couldn't protect ourselves. And you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Charles Allen asked softly. "Hope," Michelle replied. Hope for a future that's better than just surviving from one day to the next. Charles Allen rose from his place by the fire and moved to kneel beside her chair. His weathered hands were gentle as he touched the baby's tiny cheek, wonder evident in his expression. "What are you going to name her?" he asked. Michelle had been thinking about that question since the moment her daughter was born. She looked at Charles Allen's battered face, at the evidence of his willingness to die protecting them, and the answer came to her easily. "Hope," she said simply. "Her name is Hope." The baby stirred at the sound of her name, her tiny eyes opening to look up at the faces surrounding her. For a moment, the cabin was filled with perfect peace, a family united by love rather than blood or law. Charles Allen's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke again. "Michelle, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no without hurting my feelings." Michelle looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw vulnerability there, the fear of a man who had never dared to hope for something good. "What is it? Would you consider marrying me?" he asked quietly. "Not because you have to, not because of what happened tonight, but because I love you and the children more than my own life. Because I want to be your husband and their father in truth, not just in name." Michelle felt her heart swell with emotion so strong it took her breath away. She looked at this man who had started as a desperate purchase and become the foundation of everything good in her life. The answer was as clear as mountain spring water. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Charles Allen, I will marry you." The kiss they shared was gentle and full of promise, a seal on vows spoken in the quiet of a mountain cabin while their children slept peacefully nearby. It was not the grand romance of storybooks, but something deeper and more lasting. A partnership forged in hardship and tempered by shared sacrifice. When they broke apart, Charles Allen rested his forehead against hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promise you, Michelle Lewis, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision." Michelle smiled, feeling hope stir contentedly in her arms. "I could never regret the best decision I ever made." 3 months later, Michelle stood in the doorway of their new home, watching Charles Allen teach Carolyn Ross how to ride the gentle mare they had purchased with their settlement money. The little girl's laughter rang across the mountain meadow like music, a sound that had become increasingly common as she settled into her new life. The house Charles Allen had built was modest but sturdy, with 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a large main room with windows that let in the mountain sunshine. It sat on a rise that commanded a view of the entire valley, with a clear stream running through the property and good grazing land for the small herd of cattle they planned to acquire. Hope gurgled contentedly in Michelle's arms, her bright eyes tracking the movement of her father and sister in the yard. At 3 months old, she was already showing signs of the strong will that seemed to run in their unconventional family. The wedding had been a simple affair, conducted by a traveling preacher who made regular rounds through the mountain settlements. Carolyn Ross had served as maid of honor, her face glowing with happiness as she watched the 2 people she loved most in the world pledge their lives to each other. Marshal Jonathan Thomas had attended the ceremony, along with several other families who were part of the territorial settlement program. It had been a joyous celebration, made all the sweeter by the knowledge that they were truly free to build their future without fear. "Michelle," Charles Allen called from the yard, "come see how well Carolyn's doing." Michelle walked out to the fence, Hope secure in her arms, and watched as Carolyn guided the mare through a series of simple maneuvers. The child had taken to riding like she was born to it, her natural grace and fearlessness serving her well. "Look, Mama," Carolyn called out, using the title that had become as natural as breathing. "I can make her turn just by thinking about it." Michelle smiled, remembering her own first riding lessons as a child back in Missouri. "You're doing beautifully, sweetheart. Soon you'll be ready to help your father with the cattle." The mention of cattle brought Michelle's thoughts to their plans for the future. Charles Allen had proven to have a good head for business, and their small ranch was already showing signs of prosperity. They had contracts to supply beef to the mining camps, and there was talk of expanding their operation as more settlers arrived in the valley. But more importantly, they had built something that money couldn't buy. A real family, bound together by love and choice rather than blood or circumstance. Carolyn had blossomed under their care, her nightmares fading as she learned to trust in the permanence of their affection. Hope was thriving, surrounded by people who would protect and nurture her as she grew. And Michelle herself had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. In Charles Allen, she had discovered not just a husband and provider, but a true partner, someone who shared her dreams and supported her ambitions, who valued her opinions and respected her strength. That evening, as they sat around their dinner table, Carolyn suddenly looked up from her plate with a serious expression. "Papa Charles, can I ask you something?" Charles Allen set down his fork and gave the child his full attention. "Of course, little one. What's on your mind?" Carolyn's voice was thoughtful as she spoke. "Do you think my real papa would be happy that you're taking care of me now?" The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the weight of a child's need to understand her place in the world. Charles Allen considered his words carefully before responding. "I think your real papa would be very happy that you're safe and loved," he said gently. "And I think he would be proud of the brave, smart, wonderful girl you've become." Carolyn nodded solemnly, then brightened. "I think he would like you, too. You're both good at protecting people." Michelle felt tears prick her eyes at the child's simple wisdom. Carolyn had found a way to honor her past while embracing her future, understanding that love didn't diminish when it was shared, but grew stronger instead. After dinner, as Charles Allen read to Carolyn from one of the books they had ordered from back east, Michelle sat by the fire nursing hope and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow facing an uncertain future. Now she was surrounded by family, secure in their love, and confident in their ability to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard interrupted her thoughts. Charles Allen immediately set aside the book and moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that hung above the mantel. Old habits died hard, and they had all learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors. But the rider who approached their door was familiar. Marshal Jonathan Thomas dismounted from his horse and walked to the front porch with a smile on his weathered face. "Evening, folks," he called out. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Charles Allen opened the door with a welcoming gesture. "Marshal Thomas, always a pleasure. Come in, come in." The lawman removed his hat as he entered the warm house, his eyes taking in the comfortable domestic scene. "I wanted to stop by and give you some news about Kyle Morgan." Michelle felt a familiar chill at the mention of that name, despite the months that had passed since their last encounter with the gambling boss. "What about him?" "He's dead," Marshal Thomas said simply. "Killed in a shootout with federal marshals down in Arizona territory. Seems he made the mistake of robbing a mail train." Michelle felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. Kyle Morgan had been the shadow hanging over their happiness, the reminder that their past could still reach out to destroy their future. With his death, that threat was finally ended. Charles Allen's expression was grim but satisfied. "Good riddance. The world's a safer place without him." The marshal nodded agreement. "Thought you folks deserved to know. You can stop looking over your shoulders now." After Marshal Thomas left, they sat together in the quiet of their home, processing the news of Kyle Morgan's death. It felt like the final chapter of an old story, clearing the way for new adventures and possibilities. Carolyn had fallen asleep in Charles Allen's lap during the marshal's visit, her small face peaceful in the firelight. Michelle watched her husband carefully lift the child and carry her to her bedroom, his movements gentle despite his size and strength. When he returned, Michelle was still sitting by the fire with Hope, both of them bathed in the warm glow of the flames. Charles Allen settled beside them, his arm coming around Michelle's shoulders in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "It's really over," Michelle said softly. "We're truly free." Charles Allen pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his voice warm with contentment. "We've been free since the day you decided to trust a broken-down mountain man and his scared little girl." Michelle leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him and the steady beat of his heart. "I didn't trust you at first," she admitted. "I was just desperate enough to take a chance." "And now," Charles Allen asked with gentle humor. "Now I can't imagine my life without you," Michelle replied honestly. "Any of you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low while Hope dozed in Michelle's arms. Outside, the mountain winds sang through the pines, but inside their home, all was warmth and peace. The next morning brought news that would change their lives once again, though this time the change would be welcome. A rider arrived with a letter from the territorial government, offering Charles Allen a position as deputy sheriff for their mountain district. The letter explained that the territory needed experienced men who understood the challenges of mountain law enforcement. People who could work with settlers and handle the unique problems that arose in isolated communities. The pay was modest but steady, and it would allow them to serve their neighbors while maintaining their ranch. Michelle read the letter aloud while Charles Allen listened with growing interest. The position would require him to travel occasionally, investigating crimes and serving warrants throughout the mountain region. But it would also give him official authority to protect the growing community of settlers. "What do you think?" Michelle asked when she finished reading. Charles Allen was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. "It's good work, important work, and it would mean we could help other families like ours, people trying to build something good in difficult country." Carolyn looked up from where she was playing with Hope on a blanket by the fire. "Does that mean you'd be a real sheriff, Papa Charles?" "Deputy sheriff," Charles Allen corrected with a smile. "But yes, it would mean I'd have a badge and the authority to arrest bad men who hurt good people." The child's eyes lit up with excitement. "That sounds like the best job in the world." Michelle found herself agreeing with Carolyn's assessment. The position would allow Charles Allen to use his skills and experience in service of something larger than their own family, and it would provide them with additional income and security as they continued to build their life together. "I think you should accept," she said finally. "You'd be good at it, and the community needs someone they can trust." Charles Allen's expression showed his gratitude for her support. "It won't be easy work. There'll be times when I have to be away for days at a time, dealing with dangerous situations." Michelle reached over to take his hand, her grip firm and confident. "We'll manage. We've faced worse than a few lonely nights." That afternoon, Charles Allen rode into town to accept the position officially. He returned home wearing a deputy sheriff's badge and carrying a commission signed by the territorial governor. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. He stood a little straighter, spoke with a little more authority, carried himself with the confidence of a man who had found his true calling. The first few months of his new career were busy but rewarding. Charles Allen found himself dealing with everything from cattle thieves to claim jumpers, from domestic disputes to occasional violence between competing mining interests. His reputation for fairness and competence spread quickly, and settlers throughout the region began to look to him for leadership and protection. Michelle supported his work wholeheartedly, managing the ranch and caring for the children during his absences. She discovered that she had a talent for organization and planning, skills that proved valuable as their community continued to grow and develop. Carolyn thrived in their stable environment, her natural intelligence and curiosity leading her to excel in the lessons Michelle taught her. The child had also taken on the role of big sister with enthusiasm, helping to care for Hope and teaching her simple games and songs. Hope herself was growing into a bright, active baby who seemed to inherit the best qualities of her unconventional family. She had her mother's determination, her father's steady nature, and her sister's fearless spirit. One evening in late spring, as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Carolyn asked a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Mama Michelle," she said carefully, "do you think we're a real family now?" Michelle looked at the child in surprise. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Carolyn's expression was serious as she tried to explain her thoughts. "I mean, we didn't start out as a family. Papa Charles and I were sold at an auction, and you bought us. Hope wasn't born until later. So are we really a family, or are we just people who live together?" The question revealed the depth of thought that lay behind Carolyn's young face. Despite all the love and security she had experienced, part of her still wondered about the legitimacy of their bonds. Charles Allen set down the piece of leather he had been working on and gave Carolyn his full attention. "What do you think makes a family, little one?" Carolyn considered the question seriously. "I used to think it was people who were born together, or people who got married in a church. But now I think maybe it's people who choose to love each other and take care of each other, even when it's hard." Michelle felt her heart swell with pride at the child's wisdom. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. A real family is made of people who choose to be together, who support each other and protect each other no matter what happens." Charles Allen had nodded agreement. "Blood doesn't make a family, Carolyn. Love does. And we have more love in this house than some families who've been together for generations." Carolyn smiled, the uncertainty leaving her face. "Then we're definitely a real family, because I love all of you more than anything in the whole world." Hope gurgled from her place in Michelle's lap, as if adding her own agreement to the conversation. The baby was too young to understand the words, but she seemed to sense the warmth and affection surrounding her. That night, after the children were asleep, Michelle and Charles Allen sat by their bedroom window, looking out at the star-filled mountain sky. The conversation with Carolyn had stirred up memories and emotions that needed to be shared. "Do you ever regret it?" Michelle asked quietly. "The way we came together, I mean. The circumstances that brought us to that auction." Charles Allen considered the question as seriously before answering. "I regret the mistakes I made that led to those circumstances. I regret the danger I brought into your life, but I could never regret the outcome." He turned to face her, his storm gray eyes serious in the moonlight. "You saved us, Michelle. Not just from Kyle Morgan, or from poverty, or from loneliness. You saved us from being lost, from having no purpose or meaning in our lives." Michelle reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "You saved me too, you know. When my husband died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would just exist from day to day until the baby was born, and then probably die in childbirth like so many women do. Instead," Charles Allen said softly, "you found a new life, a better life." "We found it together," Michelle corrected. "All of us, even Hope, born into this family we built from nothing." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the stars wheel overhead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but they would face them as they had faced everything else, together. 2 years later, Michelle stood in the yard of their expanded ranch, watching Charles Allen teach 4-year-old Hope how to feed the chickens they had added to their growing operation. The little girl approached the task with characteristic determination, her small hands carefully scattering grain while the hens pecked around her feet. Carolyn, now 9 years old and tall for her age, was helping with the morning milking. She had become an invaluable assistant in running the ranch, her quick mind and willing hands making her far more capable than most children her age. The ranch itself had prospered beyond their wildest dreams. They now ran 50 head of cattle, had a thriving vegetable garden, and supplied eggs and milk to several neighboring families. Charles Allen's salary as deputy sheriff provided steady income, while the ranch gave them security and independence. But more importantly, they had become pillars of their growing community. Michelle had started a school that served children from 5 different families, teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic in their front room 3 days a week. Charles Allen had helped organize a volunteer fire brigade and served on the committee planning the construction of a proper church. Their reputation for fairness and generosity had spread throughout the territory. Travelers knew they could find a meal and a safe place to sleep at the Allen Ranch, and new settlers often sought their advice on everything from crop selection to dealing with difficult neighbors. On this particular morning, however, Michelle's attention was focused on a letter that had arrived with the weekly mail delivery. The envelope bore the official seal of the territorial government, and the contents would once again change the direction of their lives. "Charles," she called out, "can you come here for a moment?" He left Hope with the chickens and walked over to where Michelle stood holding the letter. His expression grew serious as he recognized the official nature of the correspondence. "What is it?" he asked. Michelle opened the envelope and read the contents quickly, her eyebrows rising with surprise. "They want you to run for sheriff. The territorial governor is asking you to stand for election as the permanent sheriff of this district." Charles Allen's face showed his shock at the unexpected offer. "Sheriff, not deputy, but the actual sheriff." Michelle continued reading. "It says here that your work as deputy has been exemplary. That crime in this district has dropped significantly under your leadership. They want to make the position permanent and give you authority over a much larger area." The implications of the offer were significant. As sheriff, Charles Allen would have greater responsibility and authority, but also greater demands on his time and energy. The position would require them to move to the county seat, a larger town about 50 miles away. But it would also represent the ultimate transformation of Charles Allen from desperate debtor to respected lawman. The man who had once been sold at auction would become the chief law enforcement officer for an entire region. "What do you think?" Charles Allen asked, though Michelle could see the excitement in his eyes despite his careful tone. "I think," Michelle said slowly, "that you've earned the right to whatever future you choose. If you want to be sheriff, then we'll find a way to make it work." The decision wasn't one to be made lightly. They spent the next several days discussing the pros and cons, weighing their love for the ranch against the opportunities the sheriff's position would provide. In the end, it was Carolyn who helped them reach their decision. The 9-year-old had been unusually quiet during the discussions, and Michelle finally asked her what she was thinking about. "I was remembering that first day," Carolyn said thoughtfully. "When you bought us at the auction, you could have chosen anyone, but you chose us because you saw something good in Papa Charles." Michelle nodded, wondering where the child's thoughts were leading. "Well, now the whole territory sees something good in him too," Carolyn continued. "And I think if he can help more people, the way he helped us, then that's what he should do." Charles Allen knelt down to the child's level, his expression gentle. "Are you sure you'd be okay with leaving this place? You've been happy here." Carolyn looked around at the ranch they had built together, then back at the man she had learned to call father. "Home isn't a place, Papa Charles. Home is being with the people who love you." The wisdom in those simple words decided the matter. Charles Allen accepted the nomination for sheriff, and the family began preparing for their next adventure. 5 years later, Sheriff Charles Allen stood on the front porch of their home in the county seat, watching his family prepare for their annual picnic. The house was larger than their mountain cabin had been, with proper bedrooms for all the children and a kitchen big enough for Michelle to pursue her love of cooking on a grander scale. Carolyn, now 14, was helping pack food into baskets while keeping an eye on 7-year-old Hope. The family had grown in other ways as well, taking in those who needed help and creating an extended family based on love rather than blood. Charles Allen reflected on how much his life had changed since that desperate day when he had put himself and Carolyn up for auction. He was now one of the most respected men in the territory, known for his fairness, his integrity, and his willingness to help anyone in need. But more importantly, he had learned what it meant to be truly wealthy. Not in money, though, they were comfortable enough, but in the things that really mattered: love, family, community, purpose. "Papa Charles," Hope called out, breaking into his thoughts. "Are you ready to go?" He looked at his youngest daughter, now 7 years old and full of energy and curiosity. She had grown into a bright, confident child who showed every sign of inheriting her parents' determination and compassion. "Almost ready, sweetheart," he replied. "Just thinking about how lucky we are." Hope skipped over to him, her young face serious. "Mama Michelle says we make our own luck by being kind to people." Charles Allen smiled, lifting his daughter onto his shoulders. "Your mama is a very wise woman." The picnic was an annual tradition, a celebration of the family they had built and the community they had helped create. As the afternoon wore on, Charles Allen found himself in conversation with former Marshal Jonathan Thomas, who had become like a father to him. "You've done well for yourself, Charles," Jonathan said, watching the children play while adults talked around the picnic tables. "We've all done well," Charles Allen replied. "This whole community has grown into something special." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "You know what I think made the difference? It's the way you and Michelle approach people. You see potential instead of problems, hope instead of despair." Charles Allen considered the older man's words. "I think we just remember what it was like to be desperate, to need someone to believe in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Michelle called for everyone's attention. "Before we go," she said, standing in the center of the group, "I want to say something. Charles and I have been talking, and we've decided to make an announcement." The crowd quieted, sensing that something important was about to be shared. Michelle's voice was clear and strong as she continued. "We've decided to start a foundation, a fund to help families in crisis, people who find themselves in desperate circumstances through no fault of their own." Charles Allen stepped up beside his wife, his sheriff's badge catching the last rays of sunlight. "We're calling it the Second Chance Foundation, because everyone deserves an opportunity to build a better life." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, but Michelle held up her hand for quiet. "There's more. We want all of you to be part of it, not just as donors, but as advisors, as people who help identify families in need and figure out the best ways to help them." One by one, members of the community stepped forward to volunteer their time and resources. As Charles Allen watched the community come together around this new purpose, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what he had been working toward all these years, even when he hadn't realized it. Later that evening, as they sat on their front porch watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Michelle leaned against Charles Allen's shoulder with a contented sigh. "Do you ever think about that day at the auction?" she asked quietly. "About how different our lives could have been." Charles Allen wrapped his arm around her, his voice warm with affection. "Every day. And every day I'm grateful that you saw something in us worth saving." Michelle smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You know what I saw that day? I saw a man who was willing to sacrifice everything to protect a little girl who wasn't even his own daughter. I saw someone who understood what it meant to be desperate and alone. And now," Charles Allen said softly, "we get to help other people who are desperate and alone." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching their children play in the yard. It was a scene of perfect domestic tranquility, but it represented something much larger. It was proof that love could triumph over circumstance, that families could be built from the most unlikely materials, and that hope could flourish even in the harshest conditions. As the children were called inside for baths and bedtime stories, Michelle and Charles Allen remained on the porch, reluctant to end this perfect day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new responsibilities, but tonight they could simply enjoy the peace and happiness they had worked so hard to create. "You know what the best part is," Michelle said as they finally prepared to go inside. "What's that?" Charles Allen asked. "The best part is knowing that our story is just beginning, that Hope and Carolyn will grow up believing that anything is possible, that love can overcome any obstacle, and that families are made by choice, not by chance." Charles Allen nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. They had started with nothing but desperation and a willingness to take a chance on each other. They had built something beautiful from that unpromising beginning, and now they were passing that same spirit of hope and determination onto the next generation. As they turned off the porch light and headed inside to tuck their children into bed, Michelle paused to look back at the town spread out below them. Lights twinkled in windows throughout the community, each one representing a family, a story, a dream being pursued against all odds. Tomorrow, the Second Chance Foundation would taste its work, reaching out to families in crisis and offering them the same opportunity for renewal that had transformed their own lives. It was a legacy worthy of the journey they had traveled, a gift to the future that honored the past. And in years to come, when people asked how it all began, they would tell the story of a pregnant woman who bought a wounded mountain man and his daughter at an auction, and how that desperate act of compassion had grown into something that changed an entire community. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. And sometimes the question whispered by a frightened child, "Are you our mama now?" becomes the foundation for a love that transforms not just one family, but an entire world.